Chapter 31. Brigands. The next day, after many penetrating stares and threats to hunt them, their children, and their children's children down if they ran off, Wight's brigade received one of the infinite waterskins. They rigged it up inside a keg and strapped it to Zipper's back, for appearance sake. The refugees had continued to trickle in overnight, but most, who had been on the road, had sheltered for the evening. Once the sun was up, they started moving again. It was much easier to reassure people with cups of cold, refreshing water. The stories they told weren't that much different. The walls had been shut, and some sort of siege started. Mostly they told of fear of fire, fear of troops, fear of thieves. There were fewer stories of actual atrocities. They saw their first soldier just before noon. He was young, dazed, and missing his helmet and shield. He welcomed the water and became slightly more coherent afterwards. He had been trapped outside the city walls and become separated from his troop. Everyone was asking him what to do, and he didn't know what to say. So he ducked whatever enemy troops he could see, tried vainly to find his own unit, and somehow ended up staggering down the road with the other refugees. He seemed somewhat resigned when they said the enemy was ahead, but that, if he surrendered, they would give him food and shelter. They relieved him of his sword, so his good intentions would be obvious. It wasn't until the early afternoon that they had their first trouble. It was pretty clear from some distance off. There was a cluster of carts, and a number of people along with them. A few soldiers could be seen perched on the leading one, which looked piled high with belongings. Several of those following argued, pleaded, and begged them, but their entreaties and the soldiers' contemptuous responses were lost to the wind. "Trouble?" asked Zipper. "Probably," said Delta. "Keep the horn ready. Do you remember the sequence for send reinforcements?" "Sort of," said Zipper. Delta stepped forward and waved her hand for the carts to stop. They ignored her, so she took the reins of the lead horse and brought it to a standstill. One of them, a sergeant, if she understood the rankings right, jumped down and sidled up to her, chest puffed out and swaggering. She could smell alcohol coming from him. He came up very close to her and stared down at her. "You'd best get out of the way," he said. She looked back levelly at him. "There seems to be a dispute here. I've been asked to ensure that—" "I don't care what you've been asked to do," he snarled, interrupting. "You'd best get out of the way," he growled, and shoved her back. But she was ready for it, and instead of letting it put her off balance, she used it to move back into a ready stance, and brought the glaive down to level. She continued to look levelly at him. Zipper shucked off the keg from her shoulders behind her and lowered her spear as well. "Are you going to cooperate, or do we have a problem?" Delta asked. He laughed and slapped his thighs. His men joined in. "Do we have a problem?" The rest came down off the cart, settled their helmets, and pulled their weapons out. Most were armed with swords that were waist-height. The big one had a sword that came up to his chest and needed 2 hands. Several of the others had shields. "I don't know. Do we have a problem?" "I think we have a problem," said Zipper in an undertone to Delta. "Yes," she said. "Let the others know we have a problem." Zipper took a horn from her belt and sounded a couple of faltering notes. The troops looked at their leader uncertainly, but he looked down the road and back at them. "Nice bluff. If you want to play a tune, let's dance." He lunged forward and swung his sword in a wide arc. Delta had her glaive choked back to parry more strongly, but at the expense of range. She did a tilt-deflect to direct his sword past her and continued the momentum into a swing back at him. He jumped back and sneered at them. "Go wide, boys. These ones have some fight, but that will make them more fun to play with afterwards." The rest started edging around them, while the big one secured his helmet. "Why can't they do those easy-to-poke stationary tortoises?" complained Zipper. Delta switched to Goblin. "On mark. Quick rush left. Me high, you low. Then back. Defend." Zipper grunted her acknowledgement. The soldiers were walking casually, giving their boss time to get ready. "Mark!" cried Delta as she skittered off to the left. The soldiers hadn't gotten into a position where they could be on all sides yet, so they couldn't take the rear while they focused on one direction. That left the mercenaries to bring both poles to bear against a single opponent. Delta closed the distance, switched her grip to further down on the pole, and swung it high towards his head. The trooper cursed, ducked, and brought his shield up to defend against it. In doing so, he both blinded himself and exposed his legs. Zipper did a step and thrust, just past Delta's side, and planted her spear into his thigh. He had not been wearing all of his armor while on the cart, and the strike held true. His curses turned to screams. His leg gave out, and he crashed to the ground. The two mercenaries immediately backed away, before the others could recover and try to circle in from behind. That had brought them together, further away from their cart. As the soldiers started to advance on them, some of the others started to quickly rifle what they could from the cart. The leader gave them several more signals, but this time they went wide, very wide, before circling around. Speaking in Goblin, Delta said, "Rush forward. Defense only. Get past. Turn and engage, then back." She gave them a moment more to let them achieve the net they were trying to make, but before they could close the net, she called the mark. Delta rushed forward, just to one side of the boss. She held her glaive, ready to deflect any swing he made as they closed. Zipper was lockstep with her, but with her spear held at length, to deter the closest shield from closing too quickly as it rushed in. The man swept, as expected, but kept his momentum and recovered quickly, bringing his own blade around close as Delta was right on top of him. She intercepted the trajectory with her lower half, knocking the momentum out of it. She stopped there, nearly belly to belly with him, at a range neither of their weapons were any good. She felt Zipper at her back, crying and lunging, and heard the spear tip clatter on the shield. It probably wasn't closing, figuring it had a few more moments to wait until the other shields to rush in. Delta kept in close, both of them moving for leverage to try to get around the other's weapon, but to block the other from doing the same. She pivoted, though, moving around him on Zipper's side, until his back was facing the direction of the cart. "2 steps back," cried Delta, again in Goblin. Zipper immediately followed her. The gap between them and the soldiers opened up, and the boss and his shield pressed forward to close the distance before they got range advantage. This, however, impeded the arriving far shields from directly entering the fray. They had a few seconds. Delta feinted on the big man, let him deflect her glaive, and continued the deflected arc to bring the splice down on the shield to his left. Quick as an adder, Zipper thrust at his face, and, unable to raise his shield, she got a lucky shot through the eye slit. The sergeant had recovered and was coming down with a strong swing, but Delta was already backing away, lockstep with Zipper. He took a step, but then thought again about facing off against the two of them by himself. The two stopped backing up when they were just out of sword range, but still within their own range. They feinted a few times to keep them jumpy. The two shields had come up, and the sergeant was questioning the shield on the ground, who had been stabbed in the face. He moaned and howled about losing an eye, and the sergeant gave up on him. He growled orders at the two shields in an undertone, and they moved to close formation, with him looming between them. They took some tentative steps forward, and didn't flinch at the feints this time. "They remembered their brains," said Zipper. "Not good." "Split," said Delta. "I'll bait 2 of them to follow me. If one splits off against you, take them. If not, hit their rear." "You can handle 2, asked Zipper. "Best I've got," said Delta. "Go so the sun is in their eyes." They pivoted away again from the cart, putting their backs to the sun. She could see them getting ready for a quick charge, but at that moment, Zipper shouted, did an extreme length thrust, and then backed quickly at an angle. Taking the bait, the sergeant growled at one to run her down and pushed the other forward with him. Delta skittered back, 2 steps back, 1 turn, just like in training, to try to keep them at her range and her out of their range. But they were too quick and came on fast. She harassed the shield and snapped it with her tip, but there was no spear to take advantage of that. So instead, she used it to try to pin him down and pivoted around so that she snagged the opponent, trying to keep the shield between her and the sergeant with his long sword. He had just got around the shield and was getting ready to swing when an egg hit him on the face, surprising him. The momentum was lost, and Delta pivoted again to keep the shield snagged and interposed. A couple of vegetables followed the egg. An incensed older woman screamed at the sergeant as she held a basket full of smashed and broken things. They had come right alongside the cart, but all of the other civilians had fled at their approach. But it was all too much for the woman, who vented her anger and frustration at the man. With a deeply insulting curse, he took 1 step forward and smashed her in the face with the guard of his sword. She went down like a lead brick and was still. The sudden white-hot rage confused Delta. She had been told to never get angry when she fought, as it robbed you of thought and reason. But the sudden silence and stillness of the woman, and the outrage done to her, got past her control. It was almost as if time went into slow motion. She did not want to defeat this opponent. She wanted to kill him. She stepped forward, and with a two-handed thrust, shoved her staff against the center of the gravity of the shield, sending him down and over. With a second step, she closed further on the sergeant, who was just turning back up to get to her. The point on the tip of her glaive was curved, which made it useful as a second hook. But, in this case, the angle was right for bringing it up from a low to high, just under the edge of his helmet. The point of the tip just right, and with the 2 solid feet on the ground, and 2 firm hands on the middle of the shaft, she drove it upwards, past the gorget, and into the flesh of the other side. His scream was immediately occluded with a gurgling as he dropped his weapon and clutched at his throat, his knees already buckling. Delta turned from him, cold fire still burning in her, towards the shield. He had recovered, and he had just got to his legs under him again, but he hadn't got back to his feet. His shield was still low, and Delta could see his wide eyes through the eye slits as he watched his boss fall. Delta pivoted, like a treacle, sliding her right hand down to the base of the shaft, body tilting in his direction. She stepped out with her right leg, twisting her right hip forward, and using that to put every muscle of her legs, back, and arm into the thrust of the glaive forward, straight into the man's eyes. It entered its target perfectly, and the blow drove at him, docked him back, and to the ground, all of Delta's might pinning him there. Time rushed back in. She staggered around and saw Zipper returning, her pace slowing, having just seen the last few seconds. Heedless, Delta dropped her glaive and sank heavily to her knees, next to the woman. "Water!" screamed Delta. She flung off her gauntlet and grabbed the woman, feeling her face and head. Blood was pouring down her forehead, and Delta moved her hair, looking for the wound, but there was too much blood to see. She looked up to scream for water again, but Zipper was already there, water streaming from a keg. Delta rinsed the woman's head, and the cold water brought her around. She took one dim look at them, and started to scream and thrash. "Hold her," said Delta, and clawed at her helmet straps. After 3 tries, she got it off and thrust her face in front of the woman. "Easy, easy," she said. "They won't hurt you again." The woman seemed to fixate for a moment on Delta's face, and then burst into sobbing. The fight went out of her, and she succumbed to their ministrations. "Put pressure right here," said Delta, guiding Zipper's hand to the gash on the woman's forehead. "Hold the flesh together. Try to stop the bleeding. I don't think her skull is cracked, but it is not good." Others had clustered around, gawping. One woman was cutting cloth strips from her clothes. "Use this," snarled Delta, indicating the sergeant. He still gurgled, but his twitching was getting weaker. The woman swallowed heavily, and then opted for the shield man, who hadn't moved since Delta struck him. They had a soaked compress pressed hard on the woman's forehead. She was watching them anxiously, with one eye that wasn't covered. "Hold this," said Delta. And when Zipper had the compress, Delta backed off, took a deep breath, and vomited to the side. She kept going until she had nothing left. Then she took the keg, rinsed her mouth out, and just sat there, eyes closed. A few minutes later, hoofbeats were heard. Major Connie, Sir Chardon, and a few others had come from the camp. Evidently they had heard the horn. They circled once, taking the situation, then dismounted. "Casualties," barked Major Connie. Delta opened her eyes, looked at Zipper, and looked back. "We're good," she said. "One ran off," said Zipper. She nodded her head at the 2 nearest her. "He can throw these 2 into the swamp." "We'll bury them, same as the rest," said Connie shortly. "I can guess what happened here. Sir Chardon, if you please. Can you please adjudicate with these good citizens and ensure that what is rightly theirs is restored to them?" Another horseman came up, leading the soldier who had run away behind him. Connie nodded at him and said to another, "See if you can contract with one of these fine folk for room in their cart for transport of the wounded, dead, and anyone else who needs it." Delta got to her feet stiffly, pushing herself up with a glaive. She saluted and said, "Sir, I request permission." "You are granted the rest of the day off," said Connie, cutting her off. "Take the cart if you want it. You've certainly earned your pay today."